All right, welcome to the mini lecture on memory. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the framework of memory and some general theories behind it. And then once we're together in class, we'll talk more about assessment and treatment that you can do to target memory specifically. So we know that memory is an integral part of our everyday life, right? It's a survival processing effect. Memory is critical for learning. So when we think about impairments in memory, we know that impaired memory is the most common deficit, one of the most common deficits observed by people with acquired brain pathology, regardless of their severity. So for example, we see memory impairment in populations with mild cognitive impairment and dementia, people with epilepsy disorders, people with psychiatric conditions, even individuals with long COVID complain of memory impairment or memory changes after their injury. So a couple of the facts that we know from research are that persisting memory and learning problems can be reported at 1, 2, and even 6 years post-injury for people with moderate to severe TBIs. Another fact from research is that impaired verbal memory has been strongly related to unemployment at 7 and 15 years post-injury. So that tells us a lot. It's not like people are dealing with memory impairments just immediately after a traumatic brain injury or acquired brain injury. This is something that's persisting and affecting their activities of daily life for many years after the initial injury. And we talked about that a little bit in our first week about just the concept of TBI being a cause and a consequence of a lot of different things like precarious housing, unemployment, incarceration. So it's really just good to keep that in mind as we think about why treatment of memory and why understanding memory is so important. So one of the broadest classifications that we can use of memory is to just split it into two. So we can split it into long-term memory and short-term memory. Long-term memory kind of is an umbrella for covering things like permanent memories, explicit or declarative memories for facts, so something like remembering all the state capitals. Long-term memory can also cover events like episodic memories or delayed intentions, which is prospective memory. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And then short-term memory is just kind of remembering maybe what happened earlier in the day, who you talked to earlier in the day, who you saw, something like that. So it is important to understand a little bit about the neuroanatomy of memory, especially as you're thinking about the person that you're working with, where their lesion was, where, what part of their brain has been affected. We know that the temporal lobe and hippocampus are really important. They're important to store new memories and to retrieve existing memories. The frontal lobe and subcortical structures are also important, and their role is more for encoding information and retrieving information through their role as kind of the executive functioners. And it's important to know and to kind of consider too that memory can be affected by lesions anywhere in the brain. So let's say the individual is having trouble with language because of where their lesion was. Those language issues can also impact their verbal memory. So even if they don't have necessarily any damage or injury to the temporal lobe or to the hippocampus, they might still have issues with memory because of those language issues and because of the lesion in the language area of the brain. Same with parietal lobe lesions that can impact visual memory. So it's kind of hard sometimes to pinpoint exactly where the injury is on that person and what exactly that's going to look like for their memory specifically. So with that in mind, also kind of on that same topic of the neuroanatomy of memory, we know that there's multiple long-term memory sites in the brain. So especially in those integration areas of like the temporal parietal lobes, those are really implicated highly in verbal and visual memory. The retrieval process is also mediated by the frontal lobe and its associations with other cortical and subcortical areas. So again, all of those different places can really impact the retrieval of memories for people. And then when we think about verbal and visual memory a little bit more, a lot of times we can kind of split it into two almost, where you could say that the left hemisphere is kind of more in charge of, or it plays a bigger role in verbal memory and with lexical information, whereas the right hemisphere is more involved with visual memory or topographical memory, retrieving some of that nonverbal information. So that construct does hold true when you have a lesion that's relatively circumscribed. So if that lesion is kind of where you expect it to be, it's contained in that specific area. The thing we have to consider is that TBIs aren't always that black and white. So again, like we talked about in that first week, a brain injury is almost like a fingerprint, right? Everything is going to be different for everybody, and everybody's brain is just wired so differently. So I think it's just good to know that although the left hemisphere is typically more involved with verbal memory and the right hemisphere is typically more involved with visual memory, that might not always hold true depending on the lesion. So if somebody had shearing, or if somebody had, a diffuse injury, it might look a little bit different. The other thing to consider is that a lot of visual memory tests also include materials that can be verbalized. So again, it can't be this black and white, clear cut, this is verbal memory, this is visual memory. It's kind of a gray area. So unless you're testing someone on a really complex, unfamiliar kind of nonsense pattern they've never seen before, having someone recall a figure or a design, it just really can't escape the verbal learning process entirely. So the next thing we're going to talk about is some of the theoretical models of human memory. Some of the early stage models split memory into 3 phases. So there's encoding, there's storage, and there's retrieval. So encoding is the early processing of the material to be learned. It involves strategies such as rehearsal and organization. The quality of encoding really determines how well the information is stored and then later retrieved. So for example, the depth of encoding or how that material is organized, that will impact the phases later on. So the next phase, it would be storage. So the storage phase is that holding of information in the memory system for future use. So there's kind of a short-term store. That's a temporary place unless that information is transferred to the long-term store. The encoding, all of that we just talked about, all of that process is happening during that short-term storage phase. The long-term store is considered to be more permanent unless it's disrupted by a pathological process, so something like a TBI. The retrieval phase would be next, and that's the part where it's pulling information from storage. So from that long-term store in order to use it. This is an area that would be, so on some of the memory tests, and again, we'll talk about that in class, this would be like the delayed recall portion of those tests. This portion, retrieval, it can be facilitated by the presentation of information in recognition formats. So for example, on the R bands, you give someone a list of words to recall. They recall as many as they can on their own. And then after that, you have another list of words and you're just asking the person yes or no, was this word on that initial list? So that's another way that you can access that memory retrieval in a different way. So the interaction between encoding, storage, and retrieval, really that quality of encoding impacts those next stages. Like we talked about, it impacts storage and retrieval. Information that's encoded deeply and that's associated with pre-existing knowledge is much more likely to be encoded more effectively and efficiently. So that makes sense, right? If you're learning new information that already relates to or is, related to pre-existing knowledge or pre-existing topic or something that you're familiar with, you're much more likely to, store that information better. Information is also better recalled under conditions that are similar to when it was learned. So for example, context-dependent memory or domain-specific memory. I think about maybe like a student in the classroom that's going over all of their spelling words or something like that. And then mom is asking the kid to recall the spelling words in the car when they're driving home or driving to hockey practice. Well, that that storage or that retrieval part of the process might be a lot harder because it's kind of out of context. It's not in the environment that those words were initially learned. And then we also know that repeated retrieval of information can increase the probability of it being retrieved at a later time. So kind of like rehearsal, right? The more that you go over something, the more that you hear it, the more that you see it, the more likely it's going to be stored and then more easily retrieved later. So there's also system models of memory. So these kind of evolved from concerns that those stage models that we just talked about were too simplistic. And people thought that maybe that model really couldn't explain the complexities of the memory process. So this system model of memory, it talks about how breakdowns occur in one component of the system while others are preserved. So for example, someone with severe amnesia, maybe they have a preserved digit span and a preserved recall of recent items, but they can't learn new material. So they kind of explain this as how memory is comprised of sets of these interrelated systems and subsystems. So this schematic, this visual kind of explains a little bit more. It has central executive, that's kind of like the top or the main system that we're working with. And then we're also working with the system of short-term memory, and those subsystems are a visual spatial sketchpad, an episodic buffer, the phonological loop. And then there's also the long-term memory system, which is visual semantics, episodic long-term memory, and language. And you can see the arrows are kind of going back and forth. They're going all around. So they think that all of these, or it's said that all of these subsystems are kind of working together. So this model of working memory is, like I said, that control system. So that kind of top is that executive network of attention. And then there's the two subsystems. So the subsystems are handling different types of information. So there's that visual spatial sketchpad. So that would be comprised of visual elements of an object like color and shape, spatial considerations like location and orientation, and also the haptics. So kinesthetic properties, tactile information, all of that. So all of that information is what's held and manipulated in that visual spatial sketchpad. And then there's the phonological or articulatory loop. That central executive system or piece that they're talking about kind of interfaces between the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, and long-term memory. So that central executive piece has the traditional frontal lobe function. So kind of that executive function of allocating attention to different processes, choosing and carrying out different activities, kind of that thought organization piece of it. So a model of long-term memory, and this is from back in the 80s and 90s. So they're kind of seeing long-term memory as, this big, there's a long-term memory store, and then that's broken down into declarative or explicit memories, and then non-declarative or implicit memories. And then declarative is broken down a little bit more, and so is non-declarative. And we'll look at that on this slide. So again, declarative memory is one kind of piece of long-term memory, and that's broken down into semantic knowledge, so knowledge of facts, so something like multiplication tables, historical facts, and then episodic memory, so knowledge of personal experiences. So for example, remembering your college graduation or what you had for breakfast this morning. The other side or piece of long-term memory is non-declarative memory. So this is kind of seen as more of implicit memory. So priming would be preserved learning even when they cannot recall the learning episode. So I think in your textbook it describes a situation where someone is learning how to play skip hop. And I don't know what skip hop is, but I'm imagining like old school, you're all probably too young for this, but there was this thing that you like put around your ankle and it would go around in a circle and you'd have to jump. I think it was called maybe that was a skip hop. Anywho, but it's a physical thing, right? So it's talking about how this individual learned how to do skip hop. And then maybe the next day, she doesn't remember that she learned how to play skip hop, but she can play skip hop. So she's going through the motions, she's jumping when she needs to jump, she's skipping when she needs to skip. But if you were to ask her, like, oh, remember we had that skip hop lesson yesterday morning, we were over by the tree, we were with, no memory of that. So that's priming. And that kind of falls with that also, that preserved learning of procedural skills, perceptual skills in people without memory. So maybe they remember how to drive it, like operate the tractor that they operated before their TBI, but they don't necessarily, or maybe they couldn't recall the steps to tell you how to do it, but their body is kind of, or their brain is remembering those procedural skills to make those things happen. And then prospective memory is the last thing that we'll talk about in this video. So prospective memory is delayed intentions. So these are like intentions to be carried out at a later time. So in a therapy session, or like in a memory test, it might be something that, so maybe at the beginning of your therapy session, you assign that client a task. So something like, make sure you flip this card over before you leave the room at the end of our session. And then that time between, so now I've assigned that intention, I've told them what they need to do. Between then and the time that they're supposed to act, so right before they leave my therapy room, that's called the retention interval. That retention interval is filled with ongoing activity. So I'm trying to prevent them from just sitting and thinking, oh yeah, before I leave the room, I have to flip that card over. I have to flip the card over. I have to flip the card over. No, they're just going. So now they have to rely on that prospective memory that it was something that they stored in their head of like, oh yeah, I have to do that at the end of my session. But they're not able to think about it during that retention interval. So the prospective memory really is reliant on the rostral prefrontal cortex. That's a key area that kind of has big involvement for successful prospective memory. So during the creation part, during the maintenance part, and the execution of that intention. All right, so that's it for our lecture on here. And then, like I said, in class, we will talk more about assessment and treatment for memory.